I want to welcome everyone to our service this morning. Um, we are a lay-led congregation bound together by 8 principles. We are a faith community that supports each other in our spiritual growth in whatever belief system or whatever framework you're in. You don't have to believe in one thing in order to be a Unitarian. Um, we want to welcome, I want to specifically welcome some of the visitors and new people here. I recognize one, which is my sister Dorothy. Um, and Dorothy, I want to welcome you. And I think there's another friend of yours. So would you introduce yourself and introduce her? And you press down on the space bar or unmute yourself to talk.
Yes, I'm Dorothy Holohan. I'm a member of the First Unitarian Universalist Church in Richmond, Virginia. And I had been in the Racine, Wisconsin and Dallas, Texas UU Church. I get around a lot. And it's really a pleasure to be here this morning. We just finished our service on the East Coast, so now I'm doing it again. And my friend here who was from Richmond and now in North Carolina, Karen Schrader, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Welcome.
Morning, everyone. I'm Karen Schrader. I live in Lexington, North Carolina right now, but as Dorothy said, I lived in Richmond and I attended the Richmond UU Church there, and I am so pleased that they've gone, well, I'm not pleased that they've gone virtual because of COVID, but I'm so pleased that they are virtual so I can participate, because I haven't really found a church that's close to me that's UU. But I did belong to UU churches in Norfolk, Virginia, Tucson, Arizona, and Richmond, Virginia. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm a Midwesterner myself. I lived in Northwest Illinois for my childhood until age 20, and then moved out here to the East Coast. But it's a pleasure, and thank you for allowing me to participate today.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining our service today. Um, I'm going to take just a brief moment to set the context for the service today. And I want to briefly review the 8th principle. The 8th principle states, we affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves in our institutions. We endorsed this 8th principle last June at our annual meeting. And as the Program Service Committee was planning this new year, we sat and said to ourselves, so what does this principle mean? And as we explored it, we put together a system of, or a setup of 6 services over January, February, and March. We looked at white fragility. We celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. We had a Reverend Tony Larson addressed us with Black Lives, White Lies. We had a local advocacy group, Love, share stories of diversity, and the we're now at March 7th, and Pastor Danny Givens is with us today. And we'll close this series with James Nelson on the 28th. So I wanted to just kind of share that framework as from various different perspectives. We're looking at what it means to address racism within our own community. This chalice, as a symbol of our commitment to our fellowship and each other, May our many sparks meet and merge in communion of heart and soul.
Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest for truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to share strength and fellowship, thus do we covenant.
The road that lies ahead of us is a long one, and the pace of progress will sometimes feel glacially slow. Never forget that glaciers over time can carve out great canyons and great lakes. Moving tectonic plates can rise up mountains over millenniums, or they can explode.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of living, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come, whoever you are, condemn, worshipper, whoever you're leaving, condemn, worshipper, lover is living, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, whoever you are, condemn, worshipper, whoever you're leaving, ours is no caravan, lover is living. Come yet again, come.
Okay. Bear with me. This is there's some long sentences in this reading, but it's really a thoughtful reading called "From Being Driven to Being Drawn" by Richard Rohr. Whatever your personal calling or delivery system for the world, it must proceed from a foundational yes to life. Your necessary no to injustice and all forms of unlove will actually become even clearer and more urgent in the silence. But now your work has a chance of being pure healing instead of impure anger and agenda. You can feel the difference in people who are working for causes. So many works of social justice have been undone by people who do all the fighting from their small, angry selves. If your prayer goes deep, your whole view of the world will change from fear and reaction to deep and positive connection, because you don't live inside a fragile and encapsulated self anymore.
To introduce Pastor Danny Gibbons. I've had the opportunity to talk with Danny several times this week and get to know him a little bit. He has quite a story which came out with our announcement at, I guess, 17, 18 years of age in a botched robbery, exchanged gunfire with a retired or a off-duty police officer. And that changed both their lives. The gift of forgiveness was one that transformed Danny's life, and he's gone on to become a minister. We learned of Danny when he spoke at the regional Mid-America UU conference, and have had the opportunity to invite him to join us. Currently, in addition to his ministry, he's the director of Transforming Systems Together in Ramsey County in Minnesota. Ramsey County is basically the area of St. Paul, Minnesota. And he's been a longtime advocate in civil rights. And he's in a real challenging position trying to pull the community together around social change. And with that, Danny, I want to really welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Lakeshore UU Fellowship, it is a pleasure and honor to be with you all. And grateful that you all remember me from the Mid-America Regional. It's not, it's a lot of stuff that goes on in our denomination, and especially regionally. And so to have, how could you not? I was probably one of the only chocolate people presenting during that time. But I'm just honored to be here. I'm honored for the tenacity of you all's fellowship, I should say, and the ambition to actually lean into the work, to begin doing the work in the social landscape of the world that we live in, and the political landscape of the world that we live in. There's so many different ways in which we could be pulled, so many different directions that we could go. And I just value the fact that a fellowship like you all has covenanted to stay at the table, and that you lifted up and continue to lift up the eighth principle. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet Brother Jim through our conversations over this past week, and having a chance to get to talk and know, and looking forward to building even more. And in talking about the sermon, I have to lift up Sister Linda, who was just like, she was on my bumper to make sure that I got a sermon title to her, to make sure that I got a little blurb for it. And I ask for you all's forgiveness in that. I am an extemporaneous preacher. Oftentimes I don't do notes. I get just a title, and then the rest is a direct download that comes from universe and the ancestors. So for me to be able to get out a blurb and all that, it was like, hey, you're asking me actually to synthesize thoughts in a way that makes sense, that you all can read legibly in some type of program. I was like, I don't have time for this. But nonetheless, you got some sense of a blurb that was sent out. Again, I'm grateful for that. In talking with Jim about kind of where you all are in your congregation, I don't mean to generalize the entirety of the congregation, but it is my understanding that you all have been leaning into the work of undoing the harmful effects of white supremacy, of systemic oppression, racialized trauma, of the ways in which white fragility pops up like weeds within our fellowships and congregations and social circles, the ways in which white privilege invites us to seemingly do a dance that's unending in the work towards liberation of all oppressed peoples and persons and groups. And it's just so, for me, I value the opportunity of being able to speak with folks who are at least trying on the garment of justice, right? And I use the phrase, the garment of justice, as a means to invite all of us here to see the work of intentionality, the work of hope, the work of change and transformation as something that can be worn, something that can be carried, something that can be felt. And in my home congregation, I pastor a church called Above Every Name that is rooted in partnership with Unity Church-Unitarian here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And one of the things that we've talked about over and over again is, what does it mean to put this garment of justice on and doing this work? And the garment of justice is this tapestry, right? For those of us who work in the knitting fields, or those of us who do quilting or sewing or whatever it is. When you think of the garment of justice, I think of a tapestry that has been created by each generation of persons who have subscribed to the narrative of justice for all and not just for some. And what I mean by that is my grandmother, who is still alive, her name is Bethel Peoples. She was born an enslaved person on a plantation in Scotland, Baton Rouge, in the early part of the 1900s. She gave birth to my father on that same plantation. And I just want to pause for a second, because I think sometimes we can listen to words as they come out and not really hear them. I want to share with you again that my grandmother, Bethel Peoples, who is still alive, was born an enslaved person on a plantation in the early 1900s in Scotland, Baton Rouge. My father, who is still alive, who's currently in his early 60s was born an enslaved person on that plantation. I am the first generation of free people within my bloodline on my paternal side. And what I mean by that is that my grandmother, Bethel Peoples, did not realize or come to the place of knowing that slavery, or enslavement, I should say, was not only abolished and outlawed within this country, but that it wasn't supposed to be practiced anymore. She didn't come to this understanding until the 1960s, when she had a chance to travel to Chicago and saw actually free Black people. So when you think about that, right, with the garment of justice that you now all wear, right? And I don't want that garment to be one that becomes weighty in this moment. I want you to see the power of the now and seeing where we all are collectively and individually in this world as it pertains to justice and liberation for all oppressed persons and groups, right? And it's that work, I just came to know that knowledge for myself. I knew to some degree the history of enslavement within my within my generation, within my family and my bloodline. But I came to know that information I just shared with you about my grandmother within this past 6 months. And so when I say this garment of justice that we wear, this becomes another square, if you will, on this tapestry for me. And for some of us, the train of that tapestry is extremely long. And for others, it is just getting started. I want to now move into a space of why I chose the sermon topic, now what, and somebody, whoever's in charge of that, can put the slide up for now what. When we talk about the political and socioeconomic landscape of our world right now, and that world is a broad term that could speak to so many different things. But when we talk about where we are in a year of having social distancing, in a year of COVID-19, in a year of newly found vaccinations, in a year of the unfortunate, brutal murder of my beloved ancestor, George Floyd, in the year of so many unnamed persons and or groups of people who have been impacted by racialized trauma, institutional oppression, right? In a year of, let us not forget, our immigrant siblings who, in some respects, a lot are still being locked in facilities and have been separated from our families. In a year of all that we have endured, right? The question has to arise, now what? And when I say the question has to arise, now what I'm speaking to is that we've been trying on so many different iterations of life over this past year, but I really want to hone in on the garment of justice as it pertains to racialized trauma that impacts Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latinx, American Indian, and our immigrant populations. With all that we have been able to learn, the books that are out now, you have My Grandmother's Hands, you have Robin DiAngelo with White Fragility, and you have the work of the book that I believe you all just finished, Me and White Supremacy, with all of the narrative out here. You have editorials now starting to write about the impacts of white supremacy. We have the FBI just now as our unveiling reports of the ways in which white supremacy has infiltrated our law enforcement system across the United States, right? As we see and experience all that we have before us in these narratives, you have to ask yourself, now what? And when we ask ourselves this question, now what? For me, it breaks down into these pieces of, first, what we know. What do you know to be true about the oppressions that are happening in this day and time? And not only what do you know to be true about those oppressions, I want you to ask yourself, with what you know to be true about those oppressions, how do those truths set with your historical truth? How do those truths set with your present narrative and what you believe to be is the reality of the world that we live in? And when we try on the garment of justice and we look at what we know, I don't want any of us to be indicted based upon how far we are along the journey, how much you've actually been able to learn or know. Because for some of us, we may just be getting started. And that's not to shade anybody. That's not to anyone's chagrin. If you're just getting started and you realize in this day and age that what you know is not truth, I encourage you and I applaud you to continue on this journey as we talk about within the 8th principle. It's a journey in this work. When we start to lean into accountability and challenging systems of oppression that have impacted our communities, that have impacted persons who many of us may not have an opportunity to have direct relationship with, but nonetheless, they are a part of this interconnected web of humanity. That's what we believe, right? So we have to look at what we know and discussing now what, and then you have to lean into this notion of what we need to learn. I was able to do, I've done a lot of interfaith work, not only just within our denomination, but I've done a lot of interfaith work just across the many denominations that exist. You can take the slide down now, thank you. I've done a lot of interfaith work across many of the denominations, whether it's Baptist, whether it's Pentecostal, whether it's doing work among our Jewish siblings, or if it's doing work in indigenous communities and non-faith traditions. I've come to see this piece right here become all the more true. And it's what do we need to learn? And that's a question that I think most of my white siblings struggle, because as your heart is being opened, as your mind is being given an opportunity to engage in new information, I think sometimes we don't know what we need to learn. It's like I think about I'm blessed to have 4 children. I have a 23-year-old daughter. I have an 18-year-old daughter. I have a 6-year-old son. And next week, I will have a 1-year-old son. My 6-year-old son is now in 1st grade, blessed to be able to go back into school in person, was doing, distant learning for the greater part of the year. But I remember a year ago when I was, took him into kindergarten and, sitting down with his teacher and beginning to understand what, not only what he needs to learn, but what we need to learn as parents, and providing, the best possible educational environment for my son. And I'll tell you that I thought because I graduated high school, because I have post-secondary education, because I consider myself at times to be an academician and scholar, that I didn't need to learn anything else, right? And the truth of the matter is this educational system has grown and continues to change, right? And I was like, well, what my times table that I learned is a little different between the ways in which they're doing mathematical equations this day. And I had to wrestle with the fact of, wait a minute, is what I know dated? Is it no longer relevant? But it has brought me so far, and I've been able to achieve so much, and I've been able to engage the world based upon the knowledge that I know, in these ways. And what do you mean I need to learn more? At this age, my brain is a little tired of learning. And that could be true for so many of us. And so we have to really sit back at that space and place. And what I had to do is what I'm inviting many of you here on this call today to do, is when we start looking at the now what, is we have to then begin to really examine how we lean in. And when I say how we lean in, there's this piece that in the book, it says, Me and White Supremacy, it says anti-racism work that does not break the heart open cannot move people toward meaningful change. I want to read that again. It says anti-racism work that does not break the heart open cannot move people toward meaningful change. It is at this place where, and breaking can be strong language for some folks, and I understand that, but I want you to be able to sit at this table with this language and be able to say, if it's not beginning to create this space or place where I'm feeling discomfort, where I don't feel as confident or secure as I would like to be, let's be frank, and learning about the history of oppressions, right? That some of us may not have been privy to. Some of us may have had like a broad level overview, and based upon your worldview at this day and age, prior to being exposed to some of the information you know now, wouldn't think that, hey, I didn't see it as that the world being this bad. I grew up in a town that had, you know, a small contingency of minorities. There was a couple Black people. There was a brown family, and you know, and we all just treated everybody like, you know, we all were humans. And I want you to lean into this notion right here at this moment that two things can be true. That within your social landscape and environment, that with what you saw for the Black and brown family may be true, and I won't even say may, is true. But on the other side of this piece, there's a truth from the Black and brown families' perspective that also needs to be valued here at this perspective. And as we lean into those truths, I think what becomes a challenge for many of us is that how can meaningful change happen involving so much hurt, right? Beginning to become acquainted with this information, right? As I was talking with Jim and discussing, you know, the heart muscle that has to grow in doing, you know, justice and liberation work, the heart muscle that has to grow in wearing the garment of justice, the heart muscle that has to grow in upholding the eighth principle for us, is one that requires some real stamina, right? Is one that requires for us to be able to, you know, not just get into this space of where it's feel good. The book of Me and White Supremacy talks about, says there's no feel good reward at the end of, other than the knowledge that you are doing this because it's the right thing to do. You will not be congratulated for it. You won't get any ally cookies for it. You won't be celebrated for it. You will have to learn to wean yourself off the addiction to instant gratification and instead develop a consciousness for doing what is right, even if nobody ever thanks you for it. This is where the leaning in requires the fullness of your personhood, right? And what I mean by saying it requires the fullness of your personhood is that at that intersection where you engage information that challenges cultural norms, that challenges the values that you've grown to be true, that challenges your worldview, that really undermines, if you will, right, the ways that you've shown up in the world. At this place, this is where we have to develop that heart muscle work of saying, you know what, I'm going to stay at the table. And stay at the table means that when all of a sudden I feel overwhelmed by the information that I'm reading or the things that I'm seeing on my TV. I can imagine from your perspective how you all felt watching the video of our beloved George Floyd as he was murdered. I personally didn't watch the video because my heart can't take any more of it. I've seen enough of it to know, you know, where this thing lands. And in that, I had to lean into at that moment of saying, I don't want to deny or ignore the fact of what has happened. I have to see it through this new lens. And the book talks about, says you can't dismantle what you cannot see, and you cannot challenge what you do not understand. What I've seen in working with a lot of my white ally siblings in this work is there's this double dutching of privilege that happens whenever the work gets too heavy, whenever the narrative becomes too invasive, when the details are more than you can stomach or bear. And I will share this, like, as another human being, right, I share that with you. And though I represent an iteration of the impacted communities who are on the receiving end of these oppressions, who are on the receiving ends of this violence, who are on the receiving end of these narratives, right? I can tell you that for me to go back and have to learn these historical truths isn't the easiest. My favorite, one of my favorite Black history figures is Frederick Douglass. And I've read his 3 books. My favorite one is My Bondage and My Freedom. And within his books, there's really brutal depictions of the treatment of people that he loved, that looked like him. It's brutal depictions of the treatment of even he in and of himself as a young man, you know, striving to navigate a world of slavery. And then I want to, I also struggle with reading about the microaggressions, because let's not polarize this and only say, well, hey, the images that we see on TV or the narratives that we read that are really violent, that are really blood drawn and all that these are the ones that really impact us the most. Let's also lean into having to read the microaggressions or experience the ways in which microaggressions show up. And I mean, microaggressions oftentimes for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are much like death by 1,000 cuts. And it's this, what I see at this particular space in the work is, when I talk about double dutching, is privilege, and white privilege gives my white ally siblings an opportunity to jump into movement, to jump into the historical language and narrative. It gives us the privilege of, oh, he didn't turn off his camera. It gives us the privilege of being able to, it gives us the privilege of being able to see when we feel good about the work and when we don't feel good about the work. And when I say double dutching, it's, I don't want you to allow white fragility to sing you a lullaby that says, you know what, I'm gonna stop for a little while. I'm gonna take a time out. This is too much. At this particular juncture, we have to lean in even more so and not take that time out. At this particular juncture, we have to begin to subscribe to decentering ourselves, but while remaining at the table. And what the decentering says, it doesn't say that what you feel, your hurt, the ways in which trauma shows up in your body, because just as when I watch these images happen on TV, or when I read about this stuff in editorials or whatever, I have my shoulders lock up. I get TMJ in my jaw. There's times when I get hard lines across my forehead, right? There's times when I'm shaking, uncontrollably. There's times when this stuff invades my psyche, when I'm trying to meditate, narratives and images are popping up, right? There's times, and that's the thing about this, is that in engaging in the work and really leaning into it, there is, unfortunately, this work isn't one that is gracious. This work isn't one that is kind and hospitable. The narrative of white supremacy and the ways that it shows up is not going to ask you, Brother Jim, it's not going to ask you, Jennifer, it's not going to ask you, Todd, it's not going to ask you, Erica, hey, is it okay if I interrupt your day right now with this this unearthly, inhumane narrative that's going to describe a people as savage, as criminal? It's not going to come up and ask you, hey, is it okay, Karen, if I just bombard your mind and your meditative space with images of children being locked in cages at the border? It's not going to come in and ask for no permission, nor is it going to send an invitation and say, do you want to do a doodle poll to participate in learning all of this? What it does is it just comes in and it invades, it pillages, it rapes, it harms, it maims, it uproots, and it destroys. Imagine, and this is my final point before I close. Imagine being an American Indian person when the first ship of young white men pulled up in search of, manifest destiny. Come on, somebody. In search of a means to be able to conquer. In search of their own self-interest being advanced. Imagine what it was like for our American Indian siblings, who on the other side were open arms and invitational, right? Saying, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, right? Come on, these are the words we just sung earlier, right? Imagine that. Imagine the same ships pulling up to the shores of the Ivory Coast, seeing beautiful people who look like myself, not knowing what they were about to encounter. these narratives sit in our body, and they're true, and they're real. And so when I say now what, I want to encourage you all to continue to do the work, right? To continue to grow that heart muscle and that stamina that is needed to stay at the table and move along in a way that makes sense for all of us. In the book, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, she states the key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. We can use it as a door out, blame the messenger and disregard the message, or we can use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? And what would it mean if this were true? What I'm saying to you all at this table is, first and foremost, ask yourself that question. Is this a door out or is this a door in? Acknowledge the ways in which the narrative, the things that you see and are experiencing, and and I'm sure as you encounter a lot of this narrative, you may play back the tape in your mind or in your heart's mind of when you were younger and seeing things with a new eye, and it was like, wow, this has been all around me. At this space, use your privilege to lean in, and not lean in to then become start harming yourself with this information, to start harming yourself and like further thinking that I must feel, all of these things in order to be justified in this. No, I want you to lean into it and support one another in the truth as it comes up. I feel uncertain. I feel culpable. I feel betwixt, all of the different feelings that come with this, but stay at the table. I know you have the privilege of being able to say, you know what, I'm going to take a time out. For Black, Brown, Indigenous persons, we don't get to take a time out. And this isn't about, hey, well, because we don't get a time out, you don't get a time out. This is about, again, that accountability that we talk about within the 8th principle. Mm-hmm. This is about, dismantling, the walls of systemic oppression and racism that have been erected, not just in our own country, in our families, sometimes in our fellowships, in our faith traditions. And so with that, I want to close. It's 10:49. I am so grateful and thankful for an opportunity to share with you all. And I believe that there's going to be a possible time for some questions or comments. Is that how this works? So, I can be along with the preacher, so I'm going to take a time out now. If you want more, I'll give you more.
Okay. Pastor Danny, thank you very much for your remarks. We have some time now for a question and answer and discussion period here. So if anyone has a question for Pastor Danny, unmute yourself and please join the discussion.
Pastor Danny, I actually appreciated your message. And I don't know if you were reading my mind or what, but the stay at the table message, I don't know what else to say. I'm going to stay at the table.
Thank you, Todd. And that I recognize that isn't necessarily the most ergonomic table, right? Sometimes it twists you. Can I talk about it? Can I tell the truth to y'all? I just want y'all to hear this, right? With being uncomfortable, right? The posture of the seating at the table doesn't promote healthy change. I just got to tell you that, right? And I have to talk about it in those plain terms because white privilege, right, and white fragility almost presents this narrative that there's going to be like this Sealy Posturepedic memory foam spot for you at the table that that just envelops you and holds you in all the places where and I hate that that's not true. I wish that there was that, but please stay at the table. We need you.
Thank you.
Jeanette.
I would like to thank you for your description of microaggressions and the impact of seeing the news. And I've heard about people being re-traumatized by that. And your description of it really made it viscerally true for me, in that I have those physical responses and hadn't even thought of that, as to call it a microaggression just, seems inadequate. But I've just been amazed in the last 3 months. I thought I was one of the good white people, and just how at every encounter, my eyes are opened more and more. And thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for your comments, Jeanette. I appreciate you making a statement around good white people. This whole narrative of good and bad people is a machination of white supremacy, is a machination of patriarchy, right? Is a machination of toxic masculinity that so many of us have just, it has almost shown up in a part of our DNA, it feels like, right? Because it has been so embedded generationally within our culture that you don't see it. And again, as it talks about in the book, it says that you cannot dismantle what you cannot see, and you cannot challenge what you do not understand. That's what me and white supremacy talks about, right? And so to be able to see it and then have the heart space that I can care enough for my eyes, right, to see what I saw and take this image, take this information that's been exposed to me, and transform it into a space of where I can show up with more truth, right? That doesn't disempower somebody else. It actually empowers the other narrative. And leaning at the end, and again, stand at the table, leaning into the tension, invites the multiple truths there. And so I appreciate your comment.
Pastor Danny, this is Jim, and I was struck by your opening remarks about your grandmother and the roots of slavery. And it's been my experience as I've been relearning American history that we really have to go back and relearn the whole piece from stolen land to slave labor that built this country as a context for moving forward. It's an important history, and thank you for your own personal reflections on that.
Thank you, Jim. It's a growing volume within our history, right? As we begin to go back and just think, you know what I'm saying? Just like legit, just think. So much of what we know and that what we have learned is based upon what has been fed to us, and it's so one-sided, and has good come from what we've learned, yes, but has harm also come from what we learned, yes. And this is where we talk about two things can be true at the same time, or multiple things can be true at the same time. And because of patriarchy gets us so, kind of stuck on a monolithic truth, we fail to really lean into the fact that there has to be, another side to this. There has to be another narrative. And going back and reading, when I read narratives of writings of enslaved person, when I read narratives of white abolitionists, right, who were discredited as being zealots, or just discredited as being, race traitors, who were discredited as being, those who were kind of, let's be honest. I mean, if those same persons were alive this day, they would be, targeted and, probably be looked at as terrorists. With the ways in which they showed up. I think about narratives of Old Man John Brown, or, these kind of narratives that are here. Like, we have to not only read it from the ancestral truth of that, hey, my skin tone participated in this, we also have to then subscribe to the ancestral truth that there were also those of my skin tone, right, who challenged this, who pushed against this. And because they weren't a part of the dominant culture, they weren't a part of the accepted collective voice, that voice was often, suppressed and kept down. I'm gonna say this in my close. Our brother Brian Stevenson talks about, the ways in which the antebellum South was, and how many slave traders were millionaires during that time and slave owners. And the question was asked, like, who did slave owners hang with? I mean, who were their friends? What was their social circles? And ideally, it was other slave owners, right? And so slave owners, I believe at that time, represented a small percentage of the population, or the white population here in the United States at that time. So let's just say hypothetically, if that population percentage was 10% of the white population in the United States, and this is again hypothetically, were slave owners, the other 90%, who were they? And why wasn't their narrative included in the history books? I mean, these are questions that you have to ask yourself within your own privileged mind. Like, wait a minute, in your own family, you see it now, that there may be some narrative of holding on to that old enslaved mentality. And then you're saying, but that's only a small percentage of our family subscribes to that narrative, right? There's 80 to 70% of our family that's, who are these wonderful, amazing, progressive human people. And who talks about that, right? And so I just want you to lean into those narratives, you all. It was the culture. It was the norm. I mean, much like growing up in a small town, and there were just ways of being, it was ways of doing things. It was what it was. And I can't sit back and say that my grandmother never had any aspirations or thoughts about what it meant to be a free person, because I know that my grandmother is a strong woman of faith, a prayer warrior, a lover of the holy. And so I know that narrative continually invited her into a space of who she is as a free woman. I can tell you that I went 42 years, I'm 43 years old. I went 42 years living with my grandmother, she prophesied over me that I'd be a preacher, all of this. I went all of these years never knowing that truth. And so the one side of the question is why did she not feel, empowered to share that truth all of these years, right? I was born in 77. She found out that, she was a free person in the 60s. So why she's just now saying this now is one question to ask myself. And two, I'm thankful that she feels empowered as a Black woman in 2021 to share her truth. And so though it's a conflicted and complicated truth, it's a truth that becomes another patch, right? Another square on my garment of justice and liberation.
Pastor Danny, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really, really appreciate it, and so does everyone in this congregation. As we get ready to close, the closing song is a rap song by an Indian American rapper, Nimish Patel, known as Nemo. And it takes place on the New York subway. And if you ever want to be in a place where there's a complete world of diversity, it's in the New York subway. So go ahead.
I spent a long time running, I never knew then what I know now. That the fruits, they always come in, but you can't go around just knocking them down. It takes a long time to show in. We plant the seeds then, and we look at them now. But the roots are always growing, no matter if I'm there or never around. Whatever dies will die. Whatever works will work. Whatever flies will fly. Whatever fails will fail. What's meant to soar will soar. I am planting seeds, nothing It's like your whole life you've been training for this moment, and when the time comes you just disown it, meaning you just surrender, don't control it. Not interested in the clay pots and mold it, or sitting next to the path trying to unfold it, or waiting for the fruits to fall down toward you. Let it go and now you're flowing, feeling quite gorgeous, so you take steps away instead of towards it. What a rush, feeling freedom with nothing to hold. We've been taught that what you touch will always turn to gold, and now we're learning when we let it go it overflows with no credit to take, cause no credit is owned. A higher power working deeper where the seeds are sowed, and when the seeds are true then they're seeds of gold. But the real gold is joy when life starts to flow, and when it does you just smile cause now you know. I spent a long time running, I never knew then what I know now. Let the fruits, they always come in, but you can't go around just knocking them down. It takes a long time to show in. We plant the seeds then and we look at them now, but the roots are always growing, no matter if I'm there or never around. Whatever grows will grow. Whatever dies will die. Whatever works will work. Whatever flies will fly. Whatever fails will fail. What's meant to soar will soar. I am planting seeds. Whatever grows will grow. When it grows, it grows. Whatever dies will die. And when it dies, it dies. Come on. If it works, it works. Whatever flies will let it fly, let it fly. Whatever fails will fail. When it fails, it fails. What's meant to soar will soar. And when it soars, it soars. I am planting seeds. Whatever grows will grow. Let it grow, let it grow. Whatever dies will die. When it dies, it dies. Whatever works will work. When it works, it works. Whatever flies will fly. Let it fly, let it fly. Whatever fails will fail. When it fails, it fails. To soar will soar. Let it soar. I am planting seeds and nothing more.
In our closing words, faithfully let us travel into a new day. In the end, they know our commitment by our actions. They will measure our legacy by our loyalty to the long haul. Our strength lies in our willingness to bear the burden of others. Our love lives on to the degree we choose to offer it, when the offering isn't easy. So let us choose wisely, with great intention and care. No, it is not simply we who make promises. Our promises also make us. So faithfully, friends, let us travel into a new day. Amen.